Hello and welcome. While I am taking a couple weeks aside, I won't say exactly off, let me just say aside, I'm serving up leftovers, smorgasbord. I've come across some old sermons of mine that are posted online, and I was amazed to find they were still there. One of them is from July 21st, 2019, and it has the title Faith and Gadgetry. Now, none of my sermons at that point were recorded uh, on video, actually, recorded at all. And it would be only 9 months until we would begin doing everything online because of the pandemic. That's why this particular sermon jumped out at me. It was about, well, I'll let you decide what it was about, but it seems to have been more timely than I expected. And so here it is. The text of this sermon is 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Now the company of prophets said to Elisha, "As you see, the place where we live under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, and let us collect logs there, one for each of us, and build a place there for us to live." He answered, "Do so." Then one of them said, "Please come with your servants." And he answered, "I will." So he went with them. When they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water. He cried out, "Alas, master, it was borrowed." Then the man of God said, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, he cut off his stick, threw it in there, and made the iron float. He said, "Pick it up." So he reached out his hand and took it. Elisha was associated in the Bible with several miracles. Those that involved healing or the deliverance of an entire nation from invasion, we can easily appreciate. The one that we hear about from this passage today, however, is one that is just a little odd. One where he made an axe head float. At best, it sounds like some sort of magic trick. But there's more to it, and good reason it would be found in the Bible, other than just look at what this guy did. Uh, and to get at what was going on, I want to tell another story. This one is about my Aunt Dot. She worked for the town of Tonawanda, New York, for many years, and I'm not entirely sure what all she did, but I do know that it involved typing, a lot of typing, because she developed carpal tunnel syndrome in her hands from all the typing that she did over a long period of time. And many years after she retired, she was still typing. She was typing away on a computer keyboard one day as she was drinking some orange soda. And as she did that, she spilled the soda all over the computer keyboard. Those activities, drinking and typing on a word processor, which is what that was at the time, did not go together well. So after she spilled the soda onto the keyboard, she grabbed some paper towels and began running them over the keys to soak things up. Do you know what can happen if you just press down on random keys? It's not pretty. It occurred to her then that maybe she should unplug it after all, which was a good move considering that the very next thing she did was to keep the whole thing from getting sticky by taking a wet dish rag and wiping it all down. And that she'd allowed to dry, but when she got back to it, it still felt sticky. So she went over it again and sprayed the entire keyboard with Windex before she plugged it in. And that was when she found out that the screen was suddenly filled with funny little lines, and the machine was making odd noises that she had never heard it make before. Now, she was not dumb. Everything that she did would have made sense if she had been using a manual typewriter, even an electrical typewriter. And yes, there were luxurious IBM Selectric models whose use overlapped with the current technology. My aunt, whose mind was at the start of what would eventually become profound forgetfulness, had simply begun to revert to the more familiar side of the technological divide that she had lived through. The story of Elijah and the axe head comes to us from a time of technological change, similar to what we've been experiencing, but much more profound and of deeper consequence. Believe it or not. It comes to us from a time when, well, look at it this way. Anybody who has ever used an axe knows that an axe handle is liable to break. Even a small hatchet will break. If you were a Boy Scout, you were taught never to stay near anybody who was using a hatchet or an axe because of that. If it broke, the metal part would go flying and somebody could easily get hurt. In fact, we still talk about somebody flying off the handle. You know what that means. Somebody goes off in some random direction and you don't know how bad it's going to be. Only in this case, it was a literal flying off the handle that took place. And the man who was using it cried out, "Alas, master, it was borrowed." Now, most of us, many of us, have been in a position where at some point we've had to borrow something like a chainsaw or something like that, but not an axe. An axe and a hatchet, those are basic kind of tools that you would not even begin to go and think about building a cabin, which this man was doing, without having with you. And it would not be a big deal if you didn't already have one. You go to the hardware store, you buy one, and off you go. But this comes to us from a time when the Bronze Age was turning into the Iron Age. And iron itself was a rare thing. In fact, it was more than rare, it was considered a matter of security. One commentator on this passage says, whereas axes were relatively inexpensive in modern times, they were not so in ancient Israel, where iron was scarce and, in time of war, largely reserved for military use. In the same way that we might have warnings and restrictions on computer technology or communications technology or satellite technology. At that point, it was how to smelt iron and how to turn it into weapons. In fact, when the Philistines, were told, invaded the land of the tribes of the Hebrews, one of the ways that they tried to control the land was by controlling the blacksmiths and not allowing the Hebrews to have implements of iron. The first book of Samuel tells all about that. It says there was no smith to be found throughout the land of Israel, for the Philistines had said, the Hebrews must not make swords or spears for themselves. So here we are, at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. Iron is cutting edge technology, pun intended. A lost axe head is equivalent to having a company's entire IT system go down. Since the axe was borrowed, it wasn't just the user who would feel that loss, but the owner as well, and anyone else who might have benefited from the blade later on. Losing it was an embarrassment, but it was also expensive and put a lot of people into greater danger and caused them much more trouble. That's how these things work, especially at times of technology change. The summer after I graduated from high school, I worked on data entry in the financial aid office at Swarthmore College. And one day, a question that I didn't quite understand appeared on my screen. And since it was a yes or no question, I figured I had a 50-50 chance of answering it, and I pressed the button for yes. And that's when the screen froze and stayed frozen until the end of the day. That was when my boss came in holding a pile of paper about 2 feet thick. This, she said, is a printout of the entire financial aid package for every student in the school. At that time, they were still working on a mainframe, and there was, get this, one printer for the entire system. They would call you when your work was done, and you would go down to the computer room and you could pick it up, which is what she had done. And for most of the day, this had been the only document printed on campus, while all other jobs waited in line behind it. Sometimes we laugh at ourselves for the things we do or don't do and the things we say or don't say. We always chuckled at my grandmother referring to getting something from the ice box, because that for her was, at one point, what she lived with. But not all of the effects of changing technology are just a matter of terminology, and they're not all benign or trivial. And not all of them just have to do with getting used to new programs or new gadgets or new terminology. I mean, what happens to people when a new and important technology is out of reach or kept out of reach? Like an axe head that is underwater. Huge social changes come about because of what might be called, at least later on, technological progress. But some of those changes may be painful to live through. And not every person is able to live through it equally well, or navigate the changes that come along with it. When an old industry slows down or dies out, not everybody simply moves smoothly into another field. Some are too old, and by the time they retrain, nobody will hire them. Or they may have financial obligations that they cannot meet on an entry-level wage, which is what is forced upon them. Some people don't have the ability to learn whatever the up-and-coming fields require. They just don't have the background. And some who would move with the job market to another place are limited by obligations they have to family who cannot move. Others might be able to overcome all of this, but they face a degree of depression and anxiety that just gets to them and becomes overwhelming. And sometimes you see people give up. Look where you find the greatest trafficking in illegal drugs, and you can pretty much track where the changes of our own day have upset the earlier patterns without replacing them with something else. If people are shooting up in abandoned factories and vacant houses, maybe those buildings themselves bear witness to the connection between a lack of meaningful opportunity and despair, and drug use. There are almost stereotypical images that link rural poverty to the establishment of meth labs. One report from the National Institute of Health states the obvious. It says in Central Appalachia, focus groups have identified economic disparity, unemployment, and undereducation as characteristics that may increase both substance use and treatment failure. In other words, when the axe head sinks into the mud, everything else goes along with it. Without the tools, you cannot get the work done. And that is why it is imperative not to lose sight of the way that God, through Elisha, made that axe head float, a piece of iron floating up from the bottom of the Jordan River. That's the same river where Naaman's deadly leprosy was cured. It's the same river where Jesus would be baptized and the Holy Spirit would settle on him like a dove. At the direction of Elisha, the man of God, the iron axe blade floated right back up to the surface. He said, "Pick it up." And so the man reached out his hand and took it. More is happening than just a veiled promise here that if you give everything enough time, it will all work out. That's not necessarily true. There have been many places and many societies and many people who have not been able to steer their way through times of profound change. Some have collapsed. But the same report that I just read from about conditions in central Appalachia goes on to almost immediately goes on to say this. Characteristics such as strong faith in God, strong family ties, strong sense of pride, and valuing self-sufficiency, on the other hand, may act as preventive factors and help to bolster treatment effectiveness in the region. Now, mind you, this is a secular report that is saying what good faith in God does in a practical level. Though I would say that simply having faith is practical under any circumstances. I love it that that is the first characteristic that it recognizes too. Change is going to happen. Change is happening around us now. We are not still living in the Bronze Age, and we don't just use iron to cut lumber to build homes. We use steel itself as the framework for skyscrapers and barns alike. And God does not put technological change on hold for us, but does help us negotiate the difficulties that come along with it. Not all change is good, but faith helps us to evaluate the good and the bad, that we may choose wisely and recognize which is which. And when there are unintended consequences, faith helps us to respond with compassion and with care to the people who have greater difficulty finding their way through that, who might get left out or might get caught in the middle, because there are a lot of folks like that around. Across the Schuylkill River from Phoenixville is the Schuylkill Canal, which used to be a main path for coal coming down from the mountains to Philadelphia. But eventually that technology was superseded by the railroad. And eventually the canal itself was going out of business. But the lock keeper at Lock 29 in Montclair was allowed to continue living in the lock house with his sister and with his nephew. The technology had changed, but somebody had compassion on the people whose lives it would affect most directly. And to this day, the house stands there as a beautiful sight, not only of antiquarian interest or because it's an old place and just kind of quaint, but it's there because it's a sign that people really do care and can help one another through times when the axes are going underwater and God is needed to help them float up to the top again. And that's what happens when we help each other through these times. And now I'm no longer reading what I wrote back in 2019. But I'm saying we've seen it happen. And the mere fact that I'm using this whole video setup is part of that. And I suggest you look at your own life and see the places where you've seen that happen. Because God is working with us and getting us through what are going to be huge changes yet to come that we don't even know about. Because God is the same. And Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Amen.